Hello, Dan.
Morning.
How are you doing today?
I'm all right, thank you.
Yeah, how's your week going so far?
Awful, but it's about to end, so that's good.
Today we'll be talking about the VFX industry, and it's a crazy place. And you being an industry professional, your input will be invaluable. So, for the record, could you please state your name and your role, what it is you do?
My name is Dan Kreeger, and I'm the executive producer for the colour grading department.
Executive producer. That is a very, very big role. You must have worked extremely hard to get to where you are right now.
Yes, I would say that there's been quite a lot of hard work, but it's been a varied journey, so yeah.
Could you please tell us how you got to where you are right now?
Of course. It is a little bit sort of circuitous. I've not always worked in post-production. I studied sort of filmmaking. I worked at the BBC for a while. I worked in post on shoots, and my first jobs within the industry were in production companies. So I worked at a production company called Partisan when I first started in the industry, and this was like a massive thing because I loved Michel Gondry, and they represented Michel Gondry. I got to work with Michel Gondry. So working alongside him, all my sort of like massive ambitions of being a director kind of got, I don't know, kind of skewed slightly because I was sort of basking in the reflection of sort of genius. But what I realised was I love working with creative people. So from there, I started sort of working in new business and selling directors to advertising agencies and record labels mainly. So going out around London, meeting loads of people, showing them work, talking about work, and yeah, trying to find the right projects for those creatives. That was great. I did that for probably around 10 years. I ended up actually sort of co-running a production company with one of my best friends, which was amazing. We fell foul of the 2008 economic downturn, mainly because we represented like absolute weirdos and lovable weirdos, but there was no real room for lovable weirdos in the industry at that time. But we closed the company down and we kept all our friends, and I then ended up moving over into music production. So I used my skills to then go and work with a different set of creatives. So I went and worked with composers and sound designers, and that again was very similar but just a slightly different type.
Still as a producer?
I wasn't producing. I'd started producing at the end of my time in production.
So in the beginning, what were you
doing? New business. So
what is new business?
That's a good question.
Like recruitment or?
No, it's like a level of matchmaking, I suppose, in terms of I would try and find the correct projects for the creatives that I represented. So going out to advertising agencies or record labels, looking at the work that they did and trying to match that up with the creatives that I work with. So lots of different kind of things at play there, and I still do elements of that now, in that I'm still looking for the right people to collaborate with our colorists. And that's sort of been an ongoing kind of thread through all of my things, which is this kind of idea of like, well, you do this, so I want you to work with this person because I think you would make great films together. So it's exactly the same thing when I was working with composers and sound designers, because they were just a different type of beast to directors. That was good, although it's a slightly sort of, I guess I was less involved in music. A little bit like colour grading in that there's one creative and they exist in a sort of a small soundproof room, and I was just kind of giving them things and hoping that it turned out great. And so it wasn't as kind of as gratifying as I'd hoped, even though I love music. So in the end, I ended up talking to the MD of the Mill. I ran into him through a friend at an awards event, and they asked me to come in and talk to them at the Mill about something that they'd been thinking about. And that thing they'd been thinking about was they needed someone to come in and work in their colour grading department with their colorists. And in my time in production, I had spent time in colour grading suites, and I loved it. It was like part of the process that I really enjoyed. So I ended up going to work at the Mill. In fact, I crossed over with our now. And I ended up meeting Sean and Josh and Tom, who were all working at the Mill at that time. And it was a sort of particularly formative time at the mill, and sort of they just moved into the new building, and they were doing some incredible work, and it was a great time to sort of be working in that department. So I ended up doing that for another sort of 6 years, or sort of 5 years in colour, and I ended up also working with their internal post sort of production company. So there's lots of things going on. And then around the time, or just before pandemic, I had an opportunity to go over and work with a company called Territory Studio, and they were doing more long form work, which has always interested me. I love film. And they were doing things like UI and VFX for lots of sci-fi films. I'm also a sci-fi geek, so that sort of was a bit of a sort of an interesting opportunity for me to sort of take a step into a sort of a slightly different world. And again, I ended up sort of working in experiential, which is something which I hadn't worked in before, and also, you know, working on long form more than I'd worked before, because everything before that really had been commercials, or at least brand-based work or music. So then this switch allowed me to start working in film a bit more, and they needed people to come to them with expertise in commercials as well. But in the end, working through the pandemic, I ended up doing some absolutely mad jobs, which were sort of experience-based, kind of tech-based projects that were sort of at the threshold of what was possible. We ended up doing a bunch of sort of physical car UIs for, I think I can say it now, it was for Huawei. So working with a Chinese client, they were talking about autonomous vehicles and having the screens in their cars. So we were making real world user interfaces for vehicles that hadn't been made yet. Now that sounds amazing, but it's also very, very stressful. So during the pandemic, I was a bit like, oh, this is pretty horrible, but really cool and interesting. And at that point, Simone and Tom got in touch from TBA, and they were like, hey, do you fancy a change? And at this point, I kind of really fancied a change. And they offered me the opportunity to come back and work with colour, which I really wanted to do. And the combination of what Simone was doing with long form, but also the commercial work, made a lot of sense. So I sort
a bit of everything you've done up until this point.
There's loads of little threads that have kind of come through, whether it was even what I studied in terms of making short films and kind of like weird animations, that's all sort of fed through. But generally, I've always worked with teams of creatives, and I've always tried to find opportunities for them, and I've always sort of enjoyed furthering people's creative careers around me.
So just to clarify, when you first started in the industry, what was your role?
So when I first started, after I left university, I'd done a course in Birmingham called Visual Communications, which started out where I was doing graphics, photography, illustration, interactive, film. But I always knew I wanted to do film. I ended up graduating from that with a film show reel. Mm-hmm. So at that point, I thought I wanted to come to London and be a director. And so my mum turned up in Birmingham with the car. I gave her all my stuff, and then I just got on the train and went to London. And she drove back home. And when I got to London, I was handing out like VHSs at the time, posting them through doors. But they quickly realised that wasn't going to get me anywhere fast, and started looking for work. I ended up working at this place, Partisan, and that job was in the dubbing department.
Dubbing department, so you would dub
this is
films?
An old school thing, so it's not dubbing like audio dubbing. Oh. This is actually just like copying tapes.
Right.
So at this point, we didn't have, it was like nascent technology. We only just had QuickTimes. We didn't have, we had DVDs. We didn't have web links, or the website was non-existent. So it's like, this is pretty early doors stuff. This is around 2001, 2002. And my job was to make these tapes that people would take out, which I ended up then at my next job being those people that took out the tapes. But these tapes were these big 1/4-inch pneumatic tapes, and they were sort of like that size, and they were big and fun, and you put them in. But all the machines did wiring up, and you needed to edit the material to make the show reels. So that was my job, was putting together these show reels to win pitches, So, in the same way that we use WireDrive now to combine lots of people's work to make a reel that we would send to an agency, that's what I was doing with tapes. So there was loads of kind of like finding digibeaters and plugging them in and copying those things across and kind of like pressing pause and then putting another tape in and pressing play and pause. And
Sounds like an interesting job.
it was fun. I mean, it was like some brilliant kind of starter job. I was there sort of as a starter with runners around me as well, and we had a great time. It was a different time, obviously. It's like it was much more kind of analog.
So when you were a newbie or rookie in the industry, do you remember any funny or memorable stories that happened in the early days?
Well, I at this place, Partisan was particularly formative because it was my first job, but it was also like a really lucky sort of moment because there were only sort of 5 or 6, maybe I don't know, like production companies in London who were like that I knew of or were famous enough to know of, because when I was in Birmingham University, there was no websites for these companies. You couldn't look them up. You kind of had to know about them, and that's really difficult when you're in a different city. And there's still elements of that today. But, I couldn't like type in London production companies commercials and like get a list of 300 companies. I just knew of the most famous ones. One of them was Partisan because I knew about Michel Gondry, and one of them was like RSA and Black Dog, who were under the same thing. And so like those were basically the first places I turned up and kind of like went, this is my CV, and gave them the tape and kind of went, But, luckily I ended up getting this job at Partisan, which was sort of a real kind of amazing time for them. They were doing some of the best work. It was the end of Michel's work with Bjork, but he'd started working with the White Stripes and he was working with Radiohead. These were all like bands that we loved as well. And yeah, within that time we got to go on shoots as part of kind of like our training. And some of the funniest stories, I suppose, the weirdest stories were when you as a junior got sent off to do these shoots, and I had a car, this old Beetle, like 1967 Beetle, like proper like hippie throwback from like university, and they would be like, right, cool, well, you're going to go to the Kent coast tomorrow with 300 bottles of sizzle and stir sauce, and you're like, yeah, that'd be fine, that's no problem. And then you realise that 300 bottles of sizzle and stir sauce in the back of a Beetle is like quite dangerous, and you're sort of driving at 4 a.m. down to Kent in the shit car and like risking your life for the sake of a sauce. And you end up sort of doing weird things like getting, like a fire truck to clean like poo off of a director's shoe because they're the one person that trod in the poo that everyone's been avoiding all day on the set. And it's like these kind of like weird little formative things that you get to do, or go to a party and use the ticket that Michel Gondry would have used, and you use his ticket to get into the party. People at the front door look you up and down, and you kind of, put on a French accent.
So the next question is, as an executive producer, you work on a lot of jobs, and I'm sure some of those jobs are like difficult, stressful, bumpy rides. Mm-hmm. So could you tell us about one challenging thing or project or situation that, you had to deal with and how you dealt with it?
It's really, there's been so many. Honestly, I used to have trouble sleeping for a long time. When I was working in production, when you'd be going to a shoot the next day and there were things that you just didn't know were going to work. Because like, despite everyone's best efforts, you're doing this music video and the location, and you don't know whether or not you're going to have like a cable that's long enough. You've asked the guy, but is he going to bring it? And you're just there at 4 a.m. knowing you've got to get up in half an hour and you haven't slept. Yeah,
it's the anxiety of it all, because it is your responsibility at the end of the day.
Well, I remember having like a sort of an epiphany moment, and maybe it was just like experience, or maybe it was just like, I don't care anymore. One evening I was living in this like little basement flat in Highbury, and I was kind of in bed. It was the middle of summer. I was sweating and just like so anxious about the fact that the shoot was the next day, and we thought that we could park somewhere, and then they told us at 9 p.m. that you couldn't park there, and so we had to I hadn't measured the width of the truck to see if it would get down a side street, and I was just there going, I don't know if it's going to work. And this had this kind of epiphany moment. I was just like, what's the worst that could happen? I'm just going to figure it out in the morning. I'm just going to drive there and figure it out.
Did you figure it out?
And I slept for half an hour, got up and did it, and it was fine. But I guess it's that kind of, there's you work hard until you've reached the end of your sort of ability. You do your level best, and there's a bunch of stuff that will only resolve in the morning. You rely on people around you, I think, for perspective. I think that's something which, certainly I when you work in a smaller company, like maybe, at certain points I've worked in companies where it's like being 5-6 people. That's really tough because you have less people to lean on and less experience around you to sort of pull from, and less shoulders to cry on. But when we have TBA and look at the size we're at, and we're surrounded by really incredible people, you can share and talk to people, and you buddy up with your team, and you make sure that you're all in it together, and that helps an awful lot. You certainly, even me with my many years of experience, I don't know everything by any means, and I can't presume that I know best ever. So I must pull on the expertise of the people around me, because they often know far better than I.
Do you have any advice for new people trying to get into the industry, trying to get their foot through the door?
In the old days, you would have a job for life. You needed to know where you were headed. I'm an example of someone who probably wasn't given enough career advice earlier on, or didn't know what was open to them. I didn't live in London. I lived in the countryside. I wasn't cool. There were no magazines that really told me about the industry. There were no websites, like I say. One of the great things about being young now is that you can do an awful lot of research. In that first job at Partisan, one of the things they got magazines sent to them every month. So in my free time, at the end of the day, I would photocopy articles from those magazines and paste them into a book. And that would be my little scrapbook of my research and figuring things out. And I think that's a really good thing to be sort of involved with. It's know your industry, know people, be interested in, culture, but also your contemporaries and news, and have your sort of, ear to the ground a little bit, care about what you're doing, and people will really respond to that, I think. If you turn around and go, oh yeah, I know that work, that was really great, and they work with that person, you can see people's eyes light up because you're invested and you're interested. And that's something which I've always sort of lived by, which is that if you know more, or you've done your research, then things definitely get easier.
Read about things, watch things, listen to things, know who did what, and then if you manage to meet someone, just talk their head off about it, and you'll and then ask them for a job.
Yeah, honestly, it can be that simple sometimes. I certainly know people who've done it. You've got to gauge, and also one of the things to understand is that sometimes companies or people, you can't be friends with everyone. You will naturally find your way to the people that are your people. You can't look at a company and just presume that they're going to be great people, or that they'll be the right place for you just because they make cool stuff. You have to look at it and go why are these people great? And are they creative? Are they interesting? Are they nice? Are they listeners? I think it's a sort of a foundation of where I am today. I've never presumed that I would be best mates with everyone that I met. I would find my people, and those people would be with me for my career.
Well, thank you very much. This has been very useful. I can make a whole podcast episode out of this.
I haven't even touched my delicious Jarritos grapefruit.